In the royal nursery at Buckingham Palace, the future rulers of Europe were raised on a steady diet of lace, discipline, and, let's not forget, opium. Yes, opium-laced soothing syrups were a standard cure for fussy royal infants. Imagine it, the next emperor of Germany drifting off, not because he was rocked to sleep, but because Victorian medicine knocked him out cold. This was the reality hidden behind the polished portraits, a royal household that looked elegant on the outside but was run with the efficiency of a military camp. No giggling toddlers underfoot, no cozy family breakfasts, just governesses with stopwatches, fathers with moral lectures, and mothers too exhausted to notice the difference. And before we march further into those marble corridors, let me be blunt. The only way you can really support what I do is by subscribing. If you'd rather never see this channel again, then by all means, don't click it. YouTube will happily bury me like a forgotten royal diary. Now, what time is it where you're listening from? Midnight, dawn, or somewhere in between? Settle in, because tonight, you're not just peeking into the palace, you're living in it, under the same rules, the same watchful eyes, and the same suffocating lace curtains. You've arrived. The carriages have rattled away, the guards have clicked their heels, and here you are, standing before Buckingham Palace, that great limestone slab of monarchy. From the outside, it looks like everything a royal home should be, symmetrical, enormous, and smug. The facade practically sneers, as if daring you to ask whether anyone inside is actually comfortable. Step closer. The gates swing wide, and immediately the sound changes. The city noise fades, replaced by a heavy silence, the kind that settles only over places designed for ceremony. The gravel crunches beneath your shoes, echoing far louder than you'd like. You already feel watched. But that's the point. Buckingham Palace isn't just a house, it's a stage, a carefully built theater where life itself is performed for an audience of courtiers, servants, and history books yet to be written. The doors creak open, and suddenly you are swallowed whole. Inside, the air is cooler than it should be, a mix of wax, polish, and the faint tang of coal smoke from distant grates. The corridors stretch endlessly, lined with mirrors that double the space until you lose track of which version of yourself is real. Every footstep lands with a hollow ring, bouncing between marble walls until it sounds like a reprimand. Even the architecture seems to say, "Walk straighter, stand taller. Don't you dare slouch." Your eyes climb up the walls, past gilded frames containing grim portraits of ancestors you will never meet but must never disappoint. Generations of stern-eyed monarchs glare down, silently reminding you that smiling too much is unbecoming and that laughter, unless tightly rationed, is practically treason. Their painted faces are frozen, yet somehow judgment drips from the canvas. You're not just a person here. You're an extension of their legacy, another actor drafted into the family drama of empire. You might imagine that grandeur makes life easier. Spoiler, it doesn't. Think of Buckingham Palace not as a home, but as an etiquette factory. Every corridor is a conveyor belt moving you towards some duty. A reception, a dinner, a parade, another round of polite nodding at people you'd rather not meet. You cannot wander without purpose. You cannot collapse on a sofa without someone noting your posture. The palace trains you every single day to behave like a statue draped in lace and duty. And then there's Windsor Castle, the so-called retreat. You'd think a countryside fortress would be cozier, less rigid. Wrong again. Windsor is Buckingham with extra draft. Here, the corridors echo even more, the ceilings loom higher, and the furniture could double as medieval torture equipment. Walking through Windsor feels less like visiting a family getaway and more like sneaking through a history textbook where every chair has armrests sharper than your elbows and every hallway dares you to run, knowing you never will. But don't misunderstand. The grandeur is real. Step into the ballroom, and you'll be blinded by chandeliers heavy enough to crush a man. Their crystals casting fractured rainbows across walls, already gilded within an inch of their lives. Walk into the drawing room, and you'll find carpets thick enough to trip a horse, curtains so heavy you could sail them across the channel, and furniture meant less for sitting than for being admired from a cautious distance. Still, grandeur has a price. Comfort. This is not a house where you pad around in socks, laughing with siblings as you sneak bread from the kitchen. Kitchens are distant kingdoms, staffed by dozens of people you'll never know by name. Meals appear by magic, or at least by servants' weary hands, and vanish just as quickly, leaving you to wonder whether food is meant to nourish or simply to demonstrate that you had the money to overcook pheasant. Even the act of walking becomes theater. The floor beneath your shoes is so polished you could shave in the reflection, but heaven help you if you slip. Every guard, every servant, every relative lurking in the background will see, and that stumble will outlive you. Forget assassination attempts. In the palace, the real danger is tripping on waxed marble and becoming a household legend for all the wrong reasons. And what of privacy? Forget it. Doors don't protect you here. They're merely symbolic. Behind every panel lurks a servant with a chore, a secretary with papers, or a relative with questions about your conduct. Even in your own bedroom, the air feels observed. You are never alone, not truly. Every cough, every sigh, every pause too long at the window becomes fodder for whispers in corridors you didn't know existed. The worst part? This stage never closes. In a theater, actors leave the stage, curtains drop, the lights go out. In Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, there are no curtains. The performance goes on from dawn until dawn again, through balls, ceremonies, suppers, and the endless flow of signatures on documents you barely have time to read. The family itself becomes part of the set. Children dressed in miniature finery, paraded like proof that the dynasty is not only alive, but thriving. Of course, there are moments when the facade cracks. A child might spill something during a dinner, and though servants rush to erase the evidence, the tension lingers like smoke. A guest might laugh too loudly, and suddenly the room tilts, the ancestors in their frames glaring harder, reminding everyone that joy is permissible only in teaspoon doses. Life here is not about living. It's about maintaining the illusion that life is grand, dignified, and endlessly under control. So when you picture the royal family at home in the Victorian era, erase the cozy fireplace scenes and slippers by the fire. Replace them with the echo of marble corridors, the scent of polish that never fades, the weight of portraits pressing down from every wall. Yes, the palaces were impressive. Yes, they projected power. But to live inside them was to inhabit a gilded cage, a cage with better wallpaper than yours, but a cage all the same. And you, standing here in this vast echoing corridor, you already feel the walls closing in. The silence isn't peaceful. It's watchful. The grandeur doesn't comfort. It corrects. Every step reminds you, you're not at home. You're on stage. Morning in the Victorian royal household doesn't begin with birdsong drifting through open windows or children bouncing on the bed. No, it begins with protocol. It begins with the sound of boots, bells, and a palace waking up like a well-oiled machine. If you're imagining Queen Victoria snuggled under embroidered covers until noon, think again. She was up early, not rise with the sun and sip tea in bed early, but the kind of early where your first act of the day is reading state papers. Imagine opening your eyes, and before you've even washed your face, there's already a stack of documents waiting to be signed, reports on ministers waiting to be read, and a diary waiting for you to record your feelings. Because, yes, Victoria kept up her journal writing almost every morning of her life. Her day began not with leisure, but with ink. You, standing in her shoes, would find yourself at a desk by the window, scratching away with pen and paper as if the stability of the empire depended on it. Because, inconveniently, it often did. The world didn't stop while the Queen slept. And by morning, there was always something demanding her attention. A crisis in Parliament, an update from India, or just a particularly dull report about the price of coal. Enter Prince Albert. If Victoria's mornings were strict, Albert's were practically Spartan. He rose early, disciplined in every sense, because he believed a well-run household began with a well-run man. He was the kind of husband who thought that a late start was a moral failure. And so, while you might still be contemplating another 5 minutes of rest, Albert would already be at work, drafting letters, organizing plans for the children's education, or preparing notes on architecture, agriculture, or whatever new subject had seized his formidable intellect that week. To live with Albert was to live in the shadow of efficiency. The children? Ah, yes. They were not allowed the luxury of barging in, clambering onto their parents' bed with sticky fingers and breakfast crumbs. Their presence in the mornings was carefully scheduled, like everything else. A governess or servant would usher them in at the proper hour, tidy and disciplined, to present themselves before their royal parents. You, as a royal child, might hope for a smile, perhaps a brief word of affection. More likely, you'd be inspected, posture corrected, hands checked for cleanliness, answers demanded about yesterday's lessons. It was a daily performance, and failing the script could mean a sharp rebuke. Don't picture a cozy family gathering here. This was not, "Good morning, darling, how did you sleep?" This was inspection. The children's time with their parents was measured in minutes, cut short by the inevitable arrival of tutors. The royal family did not linger. They rotated through rituals like clockwork. One moment you're with your mother, the next you're dragged back into a classroom to recite French verbs or geography, while a governess looks on with hawk-like disapproval. Childhood, in this household, was not free time. It was preparation for a life of duty, and it began the moment the governess tapped her watch. Breakfast, you'd think, might offer a reprieve, a moment of warmth, a chance for the family to feel like a family. Not quite. Breakfast in the Victorian royal household was less about food and more about hierarchy. Imagine yourself seated at a long table, plates and silver arranged with military precision, footmen hovering like ghosts waiting to refill your glass. You might be hungry, but that hardly matters. What matters is the performance. Who speaks, who doesn't, who sits where, who gets served first. Every detail broadcasts rank and respect. Silence wasn't just expected, it was demanded. If conversation did occur, it followed rules. A child might not speak unless spoken to. A wife might tread carefully between respect for her husband and the presence of courtiers, and a queen might choose her words like weapons. even over eggs and toast. And don't think you'll be piling your plate high with bacon. Breakfast was restrained, modest, carefully chosen to appear sensible. The Victorians distrusted indulgence, even at the table. Now picture the sound. Not laughter or chatter, but the faint scrape of cutlery against china, the rustle of newspapers, the cough of a servant waiting discreetly for permission to approach. Even your appetite feels policed here. One wrong move, a spill, a dropped spoon, a laugh too loud, and you might as well announce to the entire palace that you've failed your role. What makes it worse is that the routine was inescapable. Every day, the same rhythm, the same steps, the same silent choreography of power. Even the youngest royal child absorbed the message. Life in this household was not yours to enjoy. It was yours to uphold. You ate not for pleasure, but for decorum. You spoke not for yourself, but for the script handed down by ancestors who still frowned from their portraits in the hall. And yet, underneath the stiffness, there were flickers of humanity. Victoria adored her children in her own complicated way. She wrote about them constantly in her diaries, their looks, their illnesses, their triumphs. Albert, too, was deeply involved in their upbringing, perhaps to the point of suffocation. He wanted them to be moral paragons, disciplined, hardworking, ready to serve. These weren't cold parents exactly, but their affection was filtered through duty, control, and an ironclad belief in order. As you finish your ceremonial breakfast and rise from the table, the day's real work looms ahead. Lessons for the children, audiences for the Queen, correspondence for Albert. But here, in this morning routine, you already see the pattern. Power disguised as domestic life, duty disguised as affection, and a family bound more by schedule than by spontaneity. The marble floors may gleam, the silver may shine, the servants may hover in near silence. But behind all that ritual is a truth impossible to ignore. This is not an ordinary family. This is a dynasty rehearsing itself every morning, a theater of power where even breakfast is a performance. And you, whether child, parent, or observer, are trapped in the script. If you think of a royal family as something warm, intimate, and affectionate, the Victorian version will quickly ruin the picture. This was not a household where children climbed into bed with their parents on a Sunday morning, or where mother and father took turns reading fairy tales by candlelight. No, the Victorian royal family was a machine, and everyone inside it had a role to play. If you stepped out of line, the entire contraption shuddered, and the ancestors on the walls looked twice as disappointed. At the head of this machine was Prince Albert, the father. Albert was the reformer, the stern moralist, the man who believed a household could be run like a factory and a family could be engineered into moral perfection. He rose early, worked relentlessly, and expected everyone around him, wife, children, even staff, to keep pace. Imagine your father not only telling you to eat your vegetables, but also drafting a 20-page report on why cabbage was vital to the stability of Europe. That was Albert. Albert was not the kind of father who left education to chance. No, he designed it. He handpicked tutors, drafted study schedules, and oversaw lessons personally. His children learned languages, history, geography, and religion under a system that bore his unmistakable signature: rigorous, structured, and absolutely exhausting. While other children might have looked forward to a game of marbles or a walk in the park, royal children under Albert had recitations, essays, and moral lectures. Fun, you see, was suspicious. a wasteful distraction from becoming a better human. And Albert wasn't cruel, he was earnest, painfully earnest. He truly believed that if his children were shaped properly, straightened like young saplings with rods and rules, they would grow into the moral backbone of Europe. But being on the receiving end of this earnestness must have felt like living inside a constant examination. You weren't just a child, you were a project, a half-finished essay in human form. Then there was Queen Victoria, the mother. Here's where the paradox begins. Victoria was deeply attached to her children. She wrote about them constantly in her diaries, fussed over their health, and delighted in their little quirks. Yet at the same time, she was distant. Not cold, exactly, but drained. Her days were split between government papers, audiences, social obligations, and the endless grind of being queen. That left precious little time for hands-on parenting. When she did interact with the children, it could be intense. One moment, she was affectionate, doting, overwhelmed by maternal pride. The next, she was scolding, impatient, or distracted by yet another stack of political reports. Imagine trying to tell your mother about your day, only to realize she's half listening while composing a letter to the Prime Minister in her head. That was Victoria, loving but perpetually preoccupied, stretched too thin between the empire and the nursery. And then there were the children themselves. Not individuals. Not really. At least, not in the way modern parents might think of their kids as unique little personalities. In the Victorian royal household, children were status symbols first, people second. They were proof of stability, living advertisements for the dynasty's strength. Each birth was celebrated not simply because a new life had arrived, but because another piece of the royal chessboard had been secured. You, as a royal child, were expected to look healthy, act obedient, and embody moral virtue at every moment. You weren't free to be loud, messy, or silly in the way ordinary children might be. If you spilled your drink at dinner, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure of decorum. If you laughed too hard, it wasn't just childish joy. It was undignified. Your very existence was meant to reassure the nation that the monarchy was in good hands. Imagine being 6 years old and already held responsible for the stability of the British Empire. That's a lot of weight for little shoulders. And behind the scenes, of course, were the governesses and tutors. These figures were closer to the children on a daily basis than their parents ever were. They enforced the rules, corrected posture, inspected handwriting, and delivered small doses of affection in the form of strict routine. For the children, the governess often felt like the real parent. Victoria and Albert were figures to impress, to fear, to revere. But the governess was the one who made sure you brushed your teeth, learned your prayers, and never forgot to sit up straight. The household itself revolved around this triangle. Albert, the stern architect, Victoria, the emotionally invested yet distant mother, and the children, carefully groomed symbols of continuity. It was a family, yes, but also a hierarchy, a moral laboratory, and a public spectacle all at once. The strangest part is how natural it seemed to them. To Albert, this wasn't harsh. It was necessary. To Victoria, it wasn't neglect. It was duty. And to the children, it wasn't unusual. It was simply life. They didn't grow up wondering why their father lectured them daily, or why their mother alternated between affection and distraction. They grew up believing that every family lived under portraits of ancestors who glared disapprovingly from the walls. Every meal was an etiquette drill, and every childhood was a rehearsal for adulthood. So when you picture the Victorian royal family at home, don't imagine cozy evenings around a hearth. Picture Albert with a stack of lesson plans, Victoria with a pen in one hand and a baby in the other, and children lined up like soldiers, hoping for approval. The palace was not just their home, it was their schoolroom, their stage, their prison. And as you stand in that polished corridor, hearing Albert's voice lecturing from behind one door and Victoria's pen scratching furiously behind another, you realize something unsettling. In this household, love and duty were not separate things. They were tangled together, impossible to untwist. To be loved was to be disciplined. To be cared for was to be corrected. And to be a child in the Victorian royal family was to grow up knowing that even your smile belonged to history. And if you've made it this far, don't let this story belong only to history. The only way you can really support what I do is by subscribing. If you don't, YouTube will bury this channel faster than the Victorians buried their emotions, and you'll never see it again. Welcome to the royal nursery, though perhaps nursery is too cheerful a word for what goes on here. In your imagination, you might expect warmth, laughter, the occasional toy strewn across the floor. Instead, picture long rows of bassinets, a faint smell of boiled linen, and the constant shuffle of starched skirts. This is not a playground. This is a training ground, disguised in lace. If you were a royal child here, your parents would not be the ones you saw most. The throne kept them too busy, or perhaps too exhausted. Instead, you would be raised by the governess system, an entire hierarchy of women hired to supervise every aspect of your existence. The governess was not a babysitter. She was the law. She set the rules for when you ate, how you spoke, how you sat, even how you breathed if she could manage it. And above her stood nannies and under-nannies, tutors and attendants, each with their own specific duties. Parents visited like guests. The governess lived as judge, jury, and disciplinarian. Meals were not moments of joy, but of routine. A bell rang, and you sat upright. Food was plain, functional, designed to nourish without inspiring too much delight. Sweets were rare, portions modest, and the expectation clear. Finish without complaint. Keep your elbows in, and never forget the correct utensil. And if you misbehaved? The governess didn't need to shout. A sharp glance across the table was enough to silence an army. Then came the medical practices, and here Victorian logic shines in its peculiar brilliance. Babies who cried too much were often given soothing syrups, mixtures of alcohol, opiates, and other ingredients best suited for knocking out a horse. In the royal nursery, such remedies were standard, even celebrated. Imagine being put to bed not with a lullaby, but with a carefully measured spoonful of laudanum. Your parents called it medicine. You might call it chemical warfare on infancy. And if the syrup didn't solve things, cold baths were the next solution. Yes, cold, icy water to stiffen the spine, to build resilience, to cleanse not just the body, but the will. There was a peculiar Victorian obsession with the idea that discomfort was good for you. A little shivering, they thought, made you stronger. Whether it worked or not, you didn't have much of a choice. The governess decided, and you obeyed. Discipline ran deeper still. The royal nursery was built on drills, sitting properly, reciting lessons, practicing bows and curtsies. Joyful chaos, the kind of noise and mess that makes ordinary childhoods memorable, was swiftly crushed. You might be handed a toy, but don't expect fun. Toys here were moral lessons in disguise, miniature sewing kits to prepare girls for duty, building blocks for boys to symbolize order and progress, religious books for all. Nothing purely whimsical, nothing without a message. Even play was practice for the future, and yet toys were the least of it. The staff themselves acted as surrogate parents. The governess knew your moods. Your tutors memorized your progress. The nanny dealt with your tears. These figures loomed larger in daily life than your mother or father. They were your confidants and your critics, the ones you both trusted and feared. Their word was law, and their approval was precious. Strangely, these staff were often closer to you than your actual family. When you scraped a knee, it was the nanny who bandaged it. When you struggled with French verbs, it was the tutor who sighed in disappointment. When you woke from nightmares, it was the under-nurse who sat by your bed until sleep returned. Parents appeared in ceremonial bursts, affectionate, yes, but always fleeting. The real grinding work of raising a child fell to the household machine. Imagine yourself here, a child of 5, dressed in fine but uncomfortable clothes, perched on a stool too tall for comfort. A governess hovers nearby, reminding you for the 100th time to sit straighter. Toys are lined neatly in a corner, untouched because playtime hasn't been scheduled. On the table sits a bottle of syrup with a label you can't read, but whose taste you already know. Through the window, you can hear the distant clatter of carriages on the palace drive. You are royal, you are important, but you are not free. The nursery wasn't cruel in the sense of whips and chains. It was cruel in its suffocating structure. Every day was predictable, controlled, measured. Your life was a timetable. Rise at this hour, eat at that hour, play quietly at this hour, study at another. Joy, spontaneity, rebellion, those things belonged outside the palace walls, not within. And the governess made sure you never forgot it. For Victoria and Albert, this system was proof of progress. To them, the nursery was not a cage, but a workshop producing disciplined heirs. They believed children should be shaped, molded, perfected. To their credit, they took an interest in the details, Albert especially, who meddled in lesson plans and insisted his children's moral compasses be aligned precisely with his own. But the result was the same, a childhood that felt less like growing up and more like being constructed. And so the royal nursery became both cradle and classroom, both comfort and prison. It provided warmth, food, and care, yes, but always on someone else's terms. It taught lessons, instilled virtues, and produced heirs, but at the cost of individuality. If you were lucky, you might catch a smile from your mother during one of her rare visits, or a kind word from your father in between lectures. But mostly, you grew under the watch of women in black dresses and men with books in their hands, each reminding you that even as a child, you were already an institution. Step back for a moment. Look around this room. The lace curtains, the polished cradles, the neatly folded clothes. It looks beautiful, doesn't it? Respectable, orderly, serene. But listen closer. To the silence, to the restrained breaths of children afraid to laugh too loudly, to the rustle of a governess's skirt sweeping across the floor. That's the true sound of the royal nursery. Not laughter, not freedom, but order, drilled in before you could even pronounce the word. Step out of the nursery and into the schoolroom, if you can call it that. It isn't a room filled with laughter, paint-splattered tables, or the smell of ink-stained mischief. It's more like a workshop where children are treated as raw material to be hammered, sanded, and polished into something resembling a moral leader. Here, your day is ruled not by your own curiosity, but by schedules so rigid they could be carved in stone. The first subject? Languages. French, German, Italian, sometimes Latin. You're expected to slip between tongues the way other children hopscotch across stones in a stream. The governess nods sternly as you recite verb conjugations, and if you falter, there's no sympathy. You don't learn languages for fun or travel. You learn them because diplomacy doesn't pause for your grammar mistakes. Then comes Scripture. Entire chapters of the Bible are drilled into your head until they stick like wallpaper paste. You must not only memorize them, but interpret them in ways that reflect virtue. Your governess doesn't just ask, "What does this passage mean?" She demands, "What does this passage mean about you?" And if you don't answer correctly, it isn't just ignorance, it's a moral failure. After Scripture, there is etiquette. Forget the modern idea of etiquette as "don't chew with your mouth open." Here, etiquette is survival. Every bow, every curtsy, every word you speak to an elder must be rehearsed until it becomes instinct. Imagine spending hours of your day practicing how to hand someone a teacup without spilling a drop, or how to sit in a chair without leaning too far back. For a royal child, posture was practically a subject in school. And then there's the strangest subject of all, European dynastic history. Other children learn fairy tales. You, however, are expected to memorize the tangled family trees of half the continent. Names, titles, marriages, each one a clue to your own future. It isn't history for its own sake. It's history as preparation, because one day you'll be married off into this very web of alliances, and you're supposed to know exactly which cousin rules which tiny patch of land. Fail to learn it, and you risk embarrassing yourself in front of some distant archduke who might, inconveniently, also be your uncle. Hovering over all of this is Albert's obsession with shaping his children into moral paragons. He believed that a child left untrained was like a wild garden, weeds everywhere, chaos underfoot. So he weeded, tirelessly. Lessons weren't simply about knowledge. They were about character. Did you show diligence? Did you demonstrate humility? Did you bow your head just low enough, but not too low, when reciting? Every subject doubled as a test of your soul. Albert's hand is everywhere. He chooses tutors carefully, inspects lesson plans, and even sneaks into classrooms to observe. Imagine your father not only demanding you study, but showing up mid-lesson to critique your Latin pronunciation. That was Albert, equal parts devoted parent and terrifying inspector. And the tutors? They were not warm, nurturing types. They were academics, professionals, men and women who treated teaching as a form of discipline. If you expected hugs and encouragement, you'd be sorely disappointed. They were more likely to sigh at your handwriting, frown at your recitation, and remind you, yet again, that the weight of the empire rests on your ability to decline French nouns. The governesses weren't much softer. They managed the line between household order and education, making sure lessons happened whether you liked it or not. Imagine a woman with impeccable posture and the ability to silence a room with a raised eyebrow. That was your governess. She wasn't cruel, but she didn't need to be. The rules spoke for themselves. And what happens if you try to resist? If you dared to yawn during a lesson or complain about the endless drills? Discipline, of course. Maybe not the cane. That was for less exalted households. But sharp words, stern looks, perhaps the dreaded report to your parents. And if Albert heard of your laziness, Prepare yourself for a lecture that could last longer than the lesson itself. Even play had its lessons. Toys, when allowed, were tools for moral instruction. Building blocks taught order. Sewing kits prepared girls for domestic responsibility. Maps doubled as geography drills. There was little distinction between learning and leisure, because leisure itself was suspect. Why waste time playing when you could be polishing your character? And yet, beneath this endless structure, children sometimes cracked. They complained of headaches, of exhaustion, of sheer boredom. Victoria herself worried about their health, though rarely enough to change the system. In her mind, Albert knew best, and Albert's system promised to produce princes and princesses who would stand taller than the rest of Europe. So imagine yourself in that schoolroom, the ticking of the clock, the scratch of pens on paper, the governess's skirt whispering across the floor. Outside, the palace grounds stretch for acres, but you don't see them. You're stuck here, repeating French verbs, memorizing dynasties, drilling etiquette until it becomes muscle memory. Childhood doesn't feel like freedom, it feels like rehearsal for adulthood. And that's the great paradox of the Victorian royal household. They loved their children fiercely, but they loved discipline more. Every lesson, every expectation, every lecture was designed to shape you into a model of duty. And whether you liked it or not, you were part of Albert's lifelong project, to turn his family into a living example of moral order. So, when you think of royal education, erase the image of bright-eyed children learning with wonder. Replace it with tired eyes, stiff backs, and endless recitations. A schoolroom not filled with laughter but with duty. Lessons not taught with warmth but with the weight of expectation. And you, the royal child, learning quickly that in this household, even knowledge belonged not to you, but to the empire. Now, it's time to eat. At least, that's what the clock says. Don't get too excited. In a Victorian royal household, mealtime wasn't about food. It was about theater. And the audience, unfortunately, was everyone at the table. Step into the dining room and look around. The table is long, unnecessarily long, the kind where if you sit at one end, you may as well send letters to the person at the other. The gleam of polished silver, the folded napkins like origami soldiers, the candles burning steadily in their holders. Everything arranged with military precision. The servants stand like statues against the walls, ready to pounce at the slightest signal. Even the chairs creak in disapproval when you sit down. Here, food is not nourishment, it's ceremony. Every dish is placed in a particular order, and who gets served first is not about hunger, but about rank. At the head of the table, Victoria and Albert preside like generals in command. The children, arrayed by age and importance, wait their turn. You may be starving, but if you are at the wrong end of the hierarchy, prepare yourself for a long, hungry stretch before the serving spoon comes your way. And don't even think about piling your plate. The portions are controlled, the choices limited, and indulgence is frowned upon. Mealtimes here are moral lessons disguised as menus. Too much food suggests gluttony. Too little, and you risk insulting the cook. There is exactly one correct amount, and you had better guess it. Now, conversation, or rather, the lack of it. Forget the lively chatter of an ordinary family meal. At this table, you don't simply talk, you perform. Conversation is sanctioned, rationed, doled out like sugar in wartime. Children do not speak unless spoken to. If a parent asks you a question, you answer with care, polite brief, and preferably in complete sentences. Jokes? Best to keep them to yourself. A laugh that rings too loudly will echo down the table and die in silence. Albert, if he's in a good mood, might steer the conversation toward lofty topics. The state of the nation, the merits of education, the progress of science. Imagine being 12 years old and asked your opinion on agricultural reform. If you don't have one, you'll have to invent something clever before the silence strangles you. Victoria, for her part, might ask after your lessons or your health, but she expects proper answers, not meandering tales about a broken toy or a funny dream. Silence, in fact, is the default. The scrape of cutlery on china, the faint drip of candle wax, the muffled shuffle of servants' shoes. These are the true sounds of the meal. Conversation is the exception, not the rule. If you misjudge the moment and speak out of turn, the look you receive across the table is enough to freeze the blood in your veins. And don't forget the etiquette rules. Napkin folded just so, fork in the correct hand, back straight against the chair. No elbows on the table, no slouching, no reaching. If you drop your spoon, it isn't just a clumsy mistake. It's a violation of the unspoken code. A footman will swoop in to replace it, but the silence that follows will remind you for hours. The meal unfolds slowly, dish by dish, as if the pacing itself is part of the discipline. Soups and roasts arrive with ceremony, but dessert is something else entirely. In the royal household, dessert is not simply the sweet end to a meal. It is a reward, a privilege, a moment of mercy at the end of restraint. If you have behaved, if you have sat straight, spoken correctly, and avoided disgrace, you may find a plate of pudding or a slice of cake before you. But if you have failed, dessert may disappear as quickly as it appeared. A withheld sweet isn't just a disappointment. It's a message. Joy itself is conditional. Even sugar obeys the hierarchy. The effect is inescapable. By the time you rise from the table, you're not full. Not really. You're drained. You've spent an hour measuring every movement, censoring every word, holding your body as rigid as the high-backed chair beneath you. Your hunger has been only partly satisfied, but your sense of duty has been thoroughly stuffed. And yet, to the Victorians, this wasn't oppressive. It was proof of order. The table was a training ground for life itself. If you could master etiquette here, under the watchful eyes of your parents and portraits of ancestors glaring down from the walls, you could master anything. The meal was a microcosm of the empire, structured, disciplined, ceremonial, and never, ever casual. Picture it again. You, small at the vast table, fork balanced just so, eyes lowered until spoken to. The servants glide silently in the background. Your father drones on about morality. Your mother corrects your posture with a glance. The custard on your plate looks like salvation, but you don't dare touch it until permission is granted. This is dinner, royal style, a ritual disguised as a meal, food as duty, conversation as performance, dessert as judgment. The empire didn't just march on armies and treaties. It marched on etiquette drilled in over roast beef and tepid soup. So the next time you imagine royal life as luxurious feasts and overflowing platters, remember this. The food might be rich, but the atmosphere is stricter than any classroom. Every bite is a reminder that you are not simply eating. You are rehearsing for history. Step away from the dining table, straighten your back, and prepare yourself. Because if meals were rehearsals for duty, the drawing rooms and parlors are the full performance. These are the places where the royal family stops being family and becomes pure spectacle. Walk through the double doors, and you'll notice it immediately. The air changes. It smells faintly of beeswax polish, coal smoke, and flowers arranged with surgical precision. The light filters in through tall windows, caught by velvet curtains heavy enough to crush a child if they ever slip down. Chairs are lined up like soldiers awaiting inspection, their backs so stiff they might as well be designed for torture rather than comfort. You don't slouch in a room like this. You don't even exhale too loudly. These rooms aren't for relaxation. They're for reputation. Everything here has been selected to tell a story about the family. The carpets with patterns so intricate they make your eyes hurt. The lace tablecloths hand-stitched by someone whose eyesight never recovered. The upholstery so pristine you hesitate to sit. Comfort is not the point. The point is to communicate. We are refined. We are proper. We are exactly as respectable as you think we should be. Now imagine you're a royal child. For you, the drawing room is not a playground. It's a stage. You're summoned into the room like an exhibit at a museum. The doors open, and in you walk. Dressed neatly, posture perfect, hair brushed within an inch of its life. You bow or curtsy, you smile politely, and then you stand there, waiting to be judged. Visitors coo at you, ask a few perfunctory questions about your lessons, and then, just like that, you're dismissed. It's a cameo appearance, designed not for your benefit, but to assure outsiders that the royal children are healthy, obedient, and appropriately dull. Dismissed, you shuffle out again, leaving the adults to their real business, drinking tea and silently judging one another. Because make no mistake, in the Victorian drawing room, tea was less a refreshment than a weapon. Guests were judged by how they poured it. Did they tip the teapot with grace? Did they spill a single drop? Did they remember that milk goes in after, not before? Get it wrong, and eyebrows twitched. Worse, whispers began. Something as small as cream poured clumsily could become the seed of an unflattering reputation that would follow you for months. And then there were the biscuits. Yes, even biscuits had rules. Eat one too quickly, and you looked greedy. Take none at all, and you looked aloof. Choose the wrong type? Well, perhaps you weren't raised properly. In these rooms, every crumb, every sip, every gesture was interpreted. Guests weren't simply visiting, they were being weighed and measured. The furniture itself joined in the moral policing. Chairs with backs so upright you couldn't dream of leaning. Sofas upholstered in fabrics designed less for comfort and more for silent endurance. Tables draped in lace so fragile you worried even setting down a teacup might count as vandalism. Everything conspired to keep you poised, composed, and visibly respectable. To sit in these rooms was to perform civility. You crossed your ankles neatly, folded your hands, and adjusted your expression into something halfway between interest and serenity. If your mind wandered, you didn't let it show. If the conversation bored you, and it almost always did, you nodded politely as if the state of someone's gout or the cost of imported tea leaves were the most thrilling subjects on earth. And yet, beneath the velvet and lace, these rooms had an edge. They were arenas. Guests tested one another here, not with swords, but with small talk. Who could make the cleverest remark without stepping over the invisible line of impropriety? Who could flatter without appearing sycophantic? Who could keep their composure when a child spilled tea or when the family dog snatched a biscuit? In a drawing room, your reputation could rise or fall based on the angle of your teacup. Victoria and Albert understood this well. They knew these rooms weren't trivial. They were weapons in the ongoing battle for respectability. For a queen, a single awkward silence in a drawing room could be read as weakness. For a prince, an overly loud laugh might be interpreted as arrogance. The royal family lived here as much for politics as for relaxation, though relaxation, as you've noticed, was hardly ever on the schedule. Even the decor itself joined the conversation. The lace whispered of industrious domestic virtue. The heavy curtains proclaimed wealth and stability. The portraits on the walls scowled down like referees, reminding everyone that the rules of propriety weren't optional. You weren't just sitting in a room. You were sitting inside a moral argument, upholstered and framed. And for the children, the message was clear. Appearances mattered more than comfort. You didn't fidget, you didn't sigh, and you certainly didn't ask if you could go outside. Your life was one long rehearsal for adulthood, and the drawing room was the dress rehearsal. So imagine yourself there. A stiff-backed chair beneath you, a cup of lukewarm tea in your hand, the sound of polite conversation floating around you like wallpaper. Every movement is measured. Every expression is calculated. You're not at home. Not really. You're in a showroom disguised as a living room, a place where the family proves to the world over and over again that they are paragons of propriety. And just as you begin to wonder whether you can bear another minute of the silence, another round of biscuits arrives. You choose one carefully, break it neatly, chew quietly, and you smile, as if the very act of restraint was the sweetest treat of all. That's the paradox of the Victorian drawing room. It looks like a place for comfort, but it's really a place for judgment, a theater disguised as a parlor, a stage where the lines are unwritten but strictly enforced. And you, whether royal child, guest, or even monarch, are just another actor waiting for your cue. If you thought your life was busy, juggling school, work, errands, maybe the occasional awkward family dinner, try being part of the Victorian royal family. Your year is not your own. It's dictated by the court calendar, a relentless conveyor belt of ceremonies, rituals, and obligations, all designed to project permanence. Permanence for the monarchy, permanence for tradition, and permanence for the idea that the royal family never sleeps, never stumbles, and certainly never cancels. From the moment January dawns, your days begin to vanish into rehearsed performances. First come the New Year's receptions. Nobles and dignitaries flood the palace, their carriages clogging the courtyard. You stand, smile, shake hands, not once but hundreds of times. Each greeting is a public vow. The monarchy still stands, and you're part of its unshakable foundation. Your cheeks ache from smiling, but no one notices. They see duty made flesh. Then, of course, there are the balls and banquets. Imagine the effort. Hours of dressing, rehearsals of etiquette, speeches carefully crafted so as not to say too much, but also not to say too little. The chandeliers blaze, the tables groan under the weight of delicacies. But don't be fooled. The ball is not for fun. It's theater. Every dance, every toast, every glance across the room reinforces the impression of stability. Even your laughter must be measured. Too loud, and you seem frivolous. Too quiet, and you seem cold. By spring, it's time for state openings and parliamentary duties. The royal family climbs into carriages, parades through the streets, and enters the Houses of Parliament under the gaze of half the nation. The robes are heavy, the crowns pinch, the speeches are carefully scripted. As you sit on the throne, listening to words drafted by ministers, you realize something odd. You're less a participant than a prop. You are the living emblem of continuity, You don't get to improvise, you get to read. And the reading itself is the point. Summer might bring what appears to be respite. Retreats to Windsor or Osborne, maybe Balmoral in Scotland. But don't be deceived. These holidays are thick with ceremonies of their own, garden parties, christenings, dedications, and visits. Even your leisure is scripted. A garden party means standing on grass while hundreds of eyes track your every move. A christening is less about welcoming a baby and more about parading a dynasty. Even a walk in the gardens is observed, recorded, and reported. Autumn? Time for anniversaries and commemorations. Every year brings a fresh round of remembering. Victories, battles, coronations, saints' days, family birthdays. Each date is marked with pomp. You are expected to show up, wear the right clothes, sing the right hymns, and never look bored. Even if you've done the exact same ritual every year since you could walk. And then winter rolls back in, with its endless cycle of banquets, speeches, and charity events. Christmas, at least, is a little brighter. Thanks to Albert, the royal family popularized the German tradition of the Christmas tree, complete with candles and ornaments. But even Christmas is less about joy and more about symbolism. The family gathered around the tree is not just a family, it's a national tableau. Mother, father, children, empire. If your stocking hides a toy, it hides under the weight of expectation. What makes all of this exhausting isn't just the frequency, it's the lack of spontaneity. Every moment is scripted. Every gesture has been thought through in advance. A ball is not simply a dance. It's a carefully choreographed display of hierarchy. A christening isn't a family celebration. It's a demonstration that the dynasty has been extended, its roots driven deeper into Europe. Even the seemingly light-hearted ceremonies are steeped in symbolism. You never just show up, you perform. And perform you must, because these rituals aren't for you. They're for everyone watching. They reassure the nation that the monarchy is alive, stable, and enduring. They reassure foreign dignitaries that Britain remains strong. They reassure history itself that the Victorians are not a people adrift, but a people anchored by tradition. And you, lucky you, are part of the anchor. The toll is heavy. Imagine a year where you never once wake up and ask, "What do I feel like doing today?" It doesn't matter. Your day is already planned, months in advance, by the court calendar. Your name is written next to ceremonies you haven't even heard of yet. You live inside a loop, moving from one ritual to another, never quite resting, never quite free. Even the smallest details are dictated. What you wear when you arrive, who you stand next to, nothing is left to chance. If your dress is the wrong shade, it could be seen as an insult. If you greet someone in the wrong order, it could spark a minor scandal. The court calendar doesn't just swallow your time, it swallows your individuality. And yet, to the Victorians, this was the essence of monarchy. The calendar wasn't a burden, it was the backbone of royal life. By repeating the same ceremonies year after year, they projected stability. Change was frightening. Continuity was comforting. And so the royal family became the ultimate symbol of permanence, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Picture yourself here. January's receptions bleed into February's dinners. Spring's parades bleed into summer's garden parties. By autumn, you've stopped asking why and started moving like clockwork, bowing at the right times, smiling at the right faces, and pretending the weight of the robes doesn't make your neck ache. And when the year finally ends, you look back and realize something eerie. You don't remember the year as a series of lived days. You remember it as a sequence of ceremonies, state openings, balls, christenings, anniversaries. You remember yourself not as a person, but as a prop, standing in the same pose under different chandeliers. That is the true meaning of the court calendar. Not joy, not rest, not even variety, just repetition, dressed up in lace and duty, convincing the world that the monarchy endures because the monarchy never changes. And so the cycle begins again. And while the monarchy could rely on endless repetition, I can't. The only way this channel survives is if you subscribe. If you don't, YouTube will quietly erase it from your feed, as forgotten as last year's ceremony. If you thought the dining room was strict and the drawing room suffocating, wait until you step into the pew. Because in the Victorian royal household, religion wasn't optional. It wasn't even a personal matter. It was the foundation of the monarchy's identity, and every sigh, every silence, every bowed head was another brick in the wall that held up the empire. Picture it, Sunday morning. The bells ring out, echoing across the palace grounds. You're ushered into the chapel, polished shoes clicking against stone floors, starched collar scratching your neck. The air smells of wax and damp hymnals. There's no skipping church, no feigning illness, no cozy mornings in bed. Attendance is compulsory, and your absence would cause more scandal than an unpaid debt. You take your place in the pew, the family arranged in precise order. Parents at the front, children ranked like steps behind them. Servants file into their designated spaces. The congregation doesn't just pray, they watch. Your folded hands are not just devotion, they're performance. Even your posture is theology. Sit up straight, look properly solemn, and for heaven's sake, don't yawn. The sermon drones on, heavy with scripture, morality, and the occasional jab at society's shortcomings. You're expected not only to listen, but to look as though you're absorbing eternal truths. Your governess's eyes are on you, ready to report if your attention drifts. And Albert? He listens like a man dissecting the Word of God into a spreadsheet of virtues and vices. But the real theater comes after the service, in the daily rhythm of family prayers. Gathered in a private room, the family kneels. The governess leads the younger children. Tutors hover nearby, and Victoria and Albert set the tone. These aren't gentle prayers whispered for comfort. They are tests of devotion. Did you close your eyes long enough? Did your voice falter on the psalm? Did you look distracted when your father bowed his head? Every sigh and shuffle is evidence of your spiritual state, and evidence in this family never goes unnoticed. It's not enough to pray. You must look as though you believe. You must demonstrate piety in ways that reassure not only your parents, but the entire idea of monarchy. After all, the Queen is not just a sovereign. She is the head of the Church of England. If her children can't master devotion, what does that say about the divine right of kings? Your private spirituality is a public obligation. This constant inspection produces a particular inheritance, not just crowns, not just castles, but guilt. Guilt passed from monarch to child like family silver, carefully polished and handed down through the generations. Albert was the master craftsman of guilt. His letters to his children are legendary for their combination of affection and disappointment. He scolded them for laziness, chastised them for pride, warned them against frivolity, all with the sighing tone of a man whose greatest burden is your failure to meet his impossible standards. Imagine receiving a 3-page letter because you slouched during prayers. each sentence reminding you how deeply you've let down both your father and the Almighty. That's Victorian parenting, royal style. Victoria had her own version. Her sighs, her silences, her sudden sharp words left children scrambling to decipher what they'd done wrong. Her love was real, but it was wrapped in constant reminders of duty, morality, and sacrifice. You weren't just her child, you were her moral project. And if you faltered, the disappointment in her eyes lingered far longer than any punishment. So you grow up in a household where guilt becomes second nature. Spill your tea? Perhaps you've insulted Providence. Forget your scripture passage. Clearly, your soul is in peril. Fail to bow deeply enough in church? A shame to the family name. No mistake is small when your life is framed as a spiritual example. And the weight isn't limited to Sunday mornings. It bleeds into daily life. You're reminded constantly that God sees everything, that your behavior reflects not just on you, but on the monarchy, on Britain, on civilization itself. Your childish misstep is never just yours. It becomes a matter of cosmic consequence. Even joy itself is tinged with guilt. Laugh too loudly, and you risk irreverence. Indulge in sweets, and you betray temperance. Desire freedom, and you forget duty. Every natural impulse is checked against a catalog of sins, and every sin has a consequence. If not in this life, then in the next. For Albert, this system made perfect sense. He believed that moral strength came from constant vigilance, that guilt was not a burden, but a guide. Better, he thought, to live under the shadow of conscience than to wander in the light of temptation. And so he wielded guilt, not as cruelty, but as care. The royal household was less about love, expressed through hugs and kisses, and more about love expressed through sighs, corrections, and endless moral reminders. For Victoria, the contradictions ran deeper. She adored her children, but her love often carried with it an undertone of anxiety. Was she raising them properly? Were they living up to their roles? Her affection was sincere, but it arrived tangled in lectures, complaints, and laments that her children never quite measured up. To be loved by Victoria was to be constantly reminded that you could do better. And so, guilt becomes not an occasional pang, but a permanent companion. You don't simply live with it, you inherit it. It shapes your posture, your prayers, your very sense of self. By adulthood, you no longer need Albert's letters or Victoria's sighs. The voice of guilt has been internalized. It whispers every time you falter, every time you hesitate, every time you long for freedom. Picture yourself again in the chapel. The organ groans, the hymn rises, the congregation drones in dutiful unison. You kneel, fold your hands, lower your head. Outwardly, you are perfect, silent, devout, obedient. Inwardly, you feel the familiar tug of doubt. Am I devoted enough? Have I done enough? Will I ever be enough? That's the legacy of religious life in the Victorian royal household. Faith, yes. Devotion, yes. But above all, guilt, a crown invisible, but heavier than gold. And as the service ends, as you rise stiffly from your knees and file out of the chapel, you realize something crucial. Religion here is not about your personal salvation. It's about survival. It binds the family together, not in comfort, but in conscience. It ensures obedience, molds morality, and reminds you at every turn that the monarchy is not just political, but divine. And if you fail, even in small human ways, the guilt will follow you like a shadow. That is the inheritance of the Victorian royal family. Not freedom, not joy, but duty, polished with devotion, sharpened with guilt, and handed down like an heirloom. If you thought being a royal child meant endless privilege, toys, tutors, and life in palaces, allow me to ruin that image. Because in the Victorian era, being born royal often meant being born a bargaining chip. You weren't just a son or a daughter. You were diplomatic cargo, packaged, polished, and shipped across Europe to strengthen alliances. Let's set the stage. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert had 9 children. 9. Enough to populate their own small kingdom if they'd wanted to. But rather than keep them close, Victoria and Albert looked at those children and saw opportunity. Each one was a potential treaty in human form, a thread in the vast web of European politics. And like parcels sent out from Buckingham Palace, their destinations were carefully chosen. Now imagine you are one of those children. You grow up surrounded by marble halls, governesses, stiff-backed lessons, and the never-ending stare of your parents' moral expectations. You work tirelessly to perfect your posture, your French verbs, your etiquette, and just when you think you might have earned a moment of rest, the hammer falls. You're getting married. Not because you found someone who makes your heart flutter, not because you're particularly fond of the groom or bride-to-be, but because your marriage will keep Europe in balance. You aren't walking down the aisle. You're being deployed. Take Victoria's daughters as an example. Princess Vicky, the eldest, was married off to Prince Frederick of Prussia at just 17. Imagine leaving your home, your mother, your siblings, and sailing to a country where you barely know the language, all because your parents thought your marriage might soften Prussia's edges. The ceremony might look glittering, but the reality was exile. You became a symbol in someone else's land, a stranger among courtiers who scrutinized your every move. And it wasn't just daughters. Sons, too, were loaded into the system. Prince Alfred was married into the Russian royal family. Prince Arthur flirted with alliances across Europe. Each child was a piece in Albert's grand design, knit Europe together through family ties, and perhaps wars would be avoided. The logic was admirable. The cost was staggering. For the children, it meant saying goodbye, not just to home, but to any real sense of personal choice. You didn't get to fall in love in a park or meet someone at a ball who swept you off your feet. Your destiny was debated at desks, written in letters, and finalized in treaties. By the time you were told, the decision was already sealed. Will you marry him? Was not really a question. It was an instruction. Picture yourself preparing for that journey. Your trunks are packed with gowns or uniforms. Your governess is weeping discreetly in the corner, and your mother is scribbling emotional diary entries about your departure. Your siblings watch silently, already aware that their turn will come. The carriage waits, and as you climb in, you realize that your life, once tightly controlled within the palace walls, will now be tightly controlled in an entirely foreign palace. And here's the cruel twist. Once you were gone, you were gone. Letters might be exchanged, yes, but visits were rare and return was unthinkable. You belonged to your new country, its court, its customs. Even your children, Victoria's grandchildren, would be raised to think of themselves not as English, but as Russian, German, Spanish, or Danish. Victoria herself struggled with this. She loved her children deeply, but she also believed in the logic of political marriages. She cried at their departures, filled her diaries with laments about empty rooms, and sometimes complained bitterly about how distant they had become. But she never stopped arranging the matches. Love bowed before strategy. Family bowed before empire. The irony is almost comical. Victoria, nicknamed the Grandmother of Europe, filled the thrones of half the continent with her offspring. By the early 20th century, her descendants sat in palaces from Berlin to Moscow to Athens. She had achieved what Albert dreamed of, a Europe bound together by bloodlines. And yet, did it prevent war? Hardly. When World War I erupted, many of those same grandchildren were pitted against one another, cousins trading Christmas cards one year and artillery fire the next. So what did this system accomplish? For the monarchy, it projected strength. For the empire, it promised stability. For the children themselves, it often meant loneliness, exile, and a life lived under alien skies. Imagine it again, this time in sharper detail. You are 13, told by your father that your future lies abroad. At 15, the suitor is introduced, chosen less for charm than for crown. At 17, you are whisked away in a dress that weighs more than your hopes. The crowd cheers, the choir sings, the bells ring. Everyone calls it a triumph of dynastic policy. But when the doors close, you are simply a teenager in a strange land, trying not to cry because homesickness isn't part of the official program. And for those left behind, the household feels emptier with each departure. One by one, siblings vanish, to Denmark, to Prussia, to Russia, until the nursery that once bustled with laughter echoes with silence. The royal family may still gather for portraits, smiling stiffly under the painter's gaze, but behind the canvas is absence, empty chairs, children who became pawns. So when you hear of royal marriages in the Victorian age, forget the fairy tales. Forget the gowns and the jewels and the endless retellings of happily ever after. The reality was far more transactional. You were valuable, not because of who you were, but because of what your hand in marriage could purchase for the crown. Your heart was an afterthought. That's the chilling truth of being royal. You were raised as a child of privilege, but you were deployed as a tool of politics. Your life was not your own. It belonged to the calendar, the court, and the map makers drawing new borders in ink. If the Victorian royal family was a theater of etiquette, then after December 1861, it became a theater of grief. That was the month Prince Albert died, and with him, the fragile rhythm of the household collapsed. Albert had been the stern moralist, the architect of family order, the man who made sure lessons were learned, posture corrected, and etiquette obeyed. Without him, the palace might have grown looser, softer. Instead, it plunged into black. Imagine waking up one morning in Windsor Castle, expecting another day of endless lessons and chilly family dinners, only to find the air thick with whispers. The prince consort is gone. The rooms feel colder. The clocks seem louder. And suddenly, everything that was once routine is draped in mourning crepe. Queen Victoria's grief was not private. It was public policy. She threw the entire household into a performance of sorrow. Black became the new uniform, not just for her, but for everyone. Children wore mourning clothes. Servants wore mourning livery. Even the household objects, mirrors, picture frames, curtains, seemed caught in the dragnet of grief. The palace itself became a mausoleum in progress. For Victoria, this was not a passing stage. She wore black for the rest of her life, nearly 40 years. To be near her was to live inside her grief, day after day, season after season. If you were one of her children, your childhood was already weighted with duty, but now it became steeped in mourning as well. Birthdays, holidays, even weddings were filtered through the dark veil of loss. You didn't just have a widowed mother. You had a mother who transformed widowhood into identity, and it wasn't optional. Grief in this household was regulated, codified, drilled into daily life like a lesson plan. Mourning clothes weren't simply black dresses or suits. They followed strict rules, crepe and bombazine for deep mourning, half-mourning fabrics like lilac or gray, introduced only after months or years of somber attire. Jewelry was restricted to jet, hairwork, or pearls, symbols of tears. Even time itself was regimented by mourning. You could not return to color until the prescribed period had passed, and in the royal household, that period stretched endlessly. The rituals went further. Rooms were kept dark, shutters closed. Albert's chambers at Windsor were preserved as though he might walk back in at any moment, his shaving gear laid out, his dressing gown waiting, his water jug refilled daily. Servants carried on this pantomime of presence, refilling glasses and preparing fires for a man long gone. If you were a child, you grew up not only with an absent father, but with the constant reminder of his absence staged in bricks and mortar. And the servants, they too were pulled into this theater of mourning. Footmen and maids had no choice but to wear mourning livery, their movements now slowed by the weight of ritual. Their lives, already dictated by the clock of palace duty, were now shackled to the timetable of grief. Mourning was not just a family affair. It was a staff affair, a nation's affair. For the children, the cost was immense. Albert had been stern, yes, but he had been a presence. With him gone, their mother's grief overshadowed everything. Victoria, once a mother distracted by politics, became a mother consumed by sorrow. She withdrew physically, spending more time secluded, often writing letters or entries to her beloved Albert in the past tense, as if he still read them. Her children found themselves neglected, not through malice, but through suffocating devotion to the memory of their father. Imagine being 10 years old, craving affection, and finding only a mother dressed head to toe in black, her eyes red from tears, her voice breaking as she told you to honor your father's memory by working harder, being better, never disappointing. Love became inseparable from mourning. Affection came cloaked in sorrow. Every smile felt guilty, every laugh inappropriate, every moment of joy tinged with betrayal. And the household adapted. Social life slowed. Ceremonies became fewer, more somber. Guests spoke in hushed tones, their laughter clipped short. Visitors found themselves walking into a palace not buzzing with state, but cloaked in death. Even foreign dignitaries commented on the gloom, yet the Queen refused to let go. Mourning had become her brand, her defiance, her identity. You can picture the effect in a single room. Lace curtains drawn, black crepe over mirrors, portraits of Albert garlanded, servants in dark livery. A hush hangs in the air, as if every footstep might disturb the sleeping dead. You sip your tea quietly, conscious that even your breathing feels too alive. This is not grief as healing. This is grief as empire, drilled into stone, woven into fabric, ritualized until it becomes the air itself. The paradox, of course, is that Victoria's mourning only magnified Albert's power. In life, he had ruled the household with order and discipline. In death, he ruled it with absence. His children could not escape his shadow. His wife built an altar of daily rituals to keep him alive. His servants continued serving him in empty rooms. He had become more present in absence than he had been in flesh. And yet, despite the endless sorrow, life in the palace trudged on. Lessons continued, meals were served. Ceremonies, though fewer, still punctuated the calendar. But everything bore the stamp of mourning. Weddings looked like funerals. christenings like memorials. The family could not escape the script Victoria had written. Now, imagine yourself as a royal child walking those marble corridors. Every portrait, every closed shutter, every whisper of crepe brushing against a doorway tells you the same story. Your father is gone, and your mother will never recover. And by extension, neither will you. Your laughter feels dangerous, your joy inappropriate. You are growing up in a palace that has transformed into a tomb. This was not just family grief, it was institutional grief. The monarchy itself wore black. The empire itself bent beneath the weight of one man's death. Newspapers published constant reminders of Victoria's devotion. Nations saw her as the eternal widow, the embodiment of Victorian mourning culture. And so the royal household, once rigid but at least alive with routines, became a shrine, a theater of mourning in which every actor knew their role. The queen, widow, the children, orphans of a father sanctified by death, the servants, silent attendants to absence. It is easy today to see this as excessive, but to the Victorians, mourning was virtue. Grief was proof of love, and the longer it lasted, the greater the love must have been. Victoria lived that creed to its extreme. She did not simply grieve Albert, she institutionalized him. She transformed the palace into a perpetual funeral, and everyone inside was cast in the play. And just like that, the palace became a stage where even silence was scripted. The only way this channel avoids the same fate, fading into quiet neglect, is if you subscribe. If you don't, it disappears, as forgotten as laughter in Victoria's mourning halls. At last you think, a break. Holidays. Surely after all the etiquette drills, the mourning rituals, the endless ceremonies, the royal family must have allowed themselves some joy. A chance to laugh freely, to relax, to set aside the scripts for at least a day? Not quite. Step into Christmas at Windsor, and you'll see what I mean. Forget the cozy fireside chaos of stockings hung crookedly and children tearing into presents. In the Victorian royal household, even joy was engineered, scripted, and moralized. Albert, ever the reformer and earnest moralist, imported his beloved German traditions. He brought with him the Christmas tree, tall, candlelit, decorated with ornaments and carefully placed sweets. But don't mistake this tree for the cheerful mess you might remember from your own childhood. This one is orderly. The candles are aligned, the ornaments spaced evenly. The sweets rationed, so no child receives more than their moral share. It is less holiday cheer and more botanical sermon. You, as a royal child, are summoned to admire the tree at the proper moment, after the governess has ensured your hair is brushed, your boots polished, and your posture rehearsed. You gasp, not too loudly, of course, at the twinkling sight, because that is what is expected. And then the next stage begins, the ritual of gifts. Now, let's lower your expectations. These are not frivolous toys meant for giggling play. No rocking horses that might crash into the furniture, no noisy drums that might disturb the Queen's nerves. Instead, gifts are practical, morally instructive, and thoroughly sensible. A sewing kit to prepare a girl for domestic virtue, a set of books to remind a boy of his intellectual and moral duties, perhaps a puzzle to improve patience, a globe, because you must always remember the vast empire you will one day symbolize. Every present is a lesson disguised as generosity. You open a box, hoping for fun, and instead you receive responsibility wrapped in ribbon. Joy is rationed, carefully monitored, parceled out like sugar in wartime. And yet, Albert and Victoria considered this the height of love. In their minds, the best gift was a moral compass disguised as a stocking stuffer. They believed frivolity corrupted, while discipline saved. So if you laughed too loudly at a sibling's silly gift, expect a stern look. If you tore the wrapping too quickly, expect a reminder that patience is a virtue. If you seemed ungrateful, prepare for a lecture on humility. The Christmas meal followed the same script. Yes, the table was rich with food, roasts, puddings, steaming terrines, but it was not a feast of abandon. It was another performance. You ate in the same silence, with the same rules, under the same gaze of portraits and parents. Dessert arrived, yes, but it was conditional, a reward for restraint, not an invitation to delight. The strict rituals extended into the very structure of the holiday. Carols were sung, but not raucously. The family gathered, but not chaotically. Every moment carried symbolic weight. You were not simply celebrating Christmas. You were demonstrating that the monarchy could embody morality, even at its most cheerful. And what about laughter? Surely a holiday must have had some room for giggles, jokes, playful pranks. Of course, but laughter here was carefully, tightly monitored. A smile was acceptable. A quiet chuckle was tolerated. But belly laughs, noisy games, the messy chaos of real joy, those were dangerous. They suggested loss of control, a crack in the palace's polished veneer. Even happiness had to obey etiquette. Imagine yourself on Christmas morning. You stand before the tree, dressed neatly, while a governess hovers nearby to ensure you don't touch the ornaments. A footman waits in the corner, carrying trays of carefully selected presents. Your siblings line up beside you, each trying to look equally grateful, equally restrained. The Queen sits, somber even in celebration, recording notes in her journal. Albert observes like an engineer, checking whether his experiment has succeeded. You open your gift, a book on European dynasties. You smile politely, because that's what's required. Inside, you die a little. And yet, there is a strange beauty to it. The candlelight flickers on the ornaments. The smell of pine fills the air. The ritual has a solemn grandeur, a kind of holiness that makes the day feel less like a holiday and more like a ceremony of belonging. You may not laugh freely, but you feel the weight of continuity, the sense that you are part of something larger than yourself. It is joy by another name, not fun, but permanence. Outside the palace, the Victorian public adored these images. The Christmas tree, the gifts, the family tableau. They were printed in illustrated papers and reproduced in middle-class homes. Albert's strict traditions became national traditions, and soon Christmas across Britain looked more like Windsor than a village hearth. What the royal children endured as duty, the nation embraced as culture. But inside the palace, the holiday never lost its edge of discipline. For the children, it was one more reminder that they were not simply sons and daughters. They were symbols. Even in joy, they carried the burden of performance. Even at Christmas, they rehearsed monarchy. So when you think of Victorian royal holidays, erase the image of carefree children unwrapping toys. Replace it with solemn rituals, candlelit trees, morally instructive presents, and laughter rationed out like a commodity. Christmas here was not about freedom. It was about order, continuity, and moral display. Step back from the tree one last time. Look at the symmetry, the candlelight, the neat pile of books and sewing kits. The scene is beautiful, yes, but it's beautiful like a painting in a gallery. Admire it, don't disturb it. Smile, but don't laugh. Celebrate, but only within the lines. That is Christmas in a Victorian royal household, a holiday so carefully disciplined it forgets what holiday meant in the first place. For all the marble, silk, and silver, Victorian palaces were not safe havens. They looked majestic, yes, but living inside one was rather like inhabiting a beautifully decorated death trap. The dangers weren't obvious assassins or palace conspiracies, though there were always whispers of those too. But the very walls, fabrics, medicines, and customs of daily life. Imagine walking into your bedroom at Buckingham Palace. The walls are covered in lush, fashionable green wallpaper. Elegant, tasteful, admired by every guest. What no one tells you is that the pigment comes from arsenic. Over time, it flakes into dust. You breathe it in as you sleep. You brush against it as you dress. Each morning you wake a little weaker, a little sicker, with no idea that the very decor is poisoning you. But appearances mattered more than safety, and if arsenic green was fashionable, then arsenic green it must be. Step into the drawing room and glance at the heavy velvet drapes. They shimmer in the lamplight, expensive and dignified. They are also highly flammable. One stray candle, and there were plenty of those, could turn an entire parlor into a funeral pyre in minutes. Imagine being told to sit perfectly still on a stiff-backed chair while the lace on your gown hovers inches from a candle flame. In a palace, danger came disguised as luxury. And the children? They weren't spared. In fact, they may have been at even greater risk. Their toys, painted in bright colors, often contained lead-based paint. They put the toys in their mouths, as children do, and absorbed poison disguised as play. Dolls, soldiers, blocks, all sparkling with the cheerful glow of slow death. But the dangers didn't stop with the furniture or the toys. They seeped into the very routines of daily life. Consider the soothing syrups given to babies. These weren't harmless mixtures of herbs and honey. They were cocktails of opium, morphine, and alcohol, designed to keep infants quiet so the household could function in peace. If you were a royal baby, you were likely dosed regularly, drifting into chemically induced silence, your cries suppressed by what amounted to narcotics. To your governess, it was medicine. To you, it was sedation. And as you grew, new dangers awaited. For women, the greatest hazard often came from fashion itself. The corset, celebrated as the pinnacle of feminine elegance, squeezed the body into shapes that looked beautiful in portraits but brutal in reality. Imagine trying to breathe with your ribs compressed, your lungs restricted, your stomach organs displaced. Fainting was common. Digestion was wrecked. Yet fainting itself was rebranded as feminine delicacy, proof that you were refined enough to suffer gracefully. Health in this household was never just about being well. It was about appearances. You could be pale and weak, but if you looked proper, corset-laced, posture upright, etiquette flawless, then you were considered perfectly fit for duty. Illness, when it did strike, was treated with secrecy and restraint. After all, what would it look like if the very family symbolizing stability appeared vulnerable? So, if you were a royal child with a fever, you were tucked away behind closed doors. Servants whispered in the corridors. Letters flew between doctors, but the outside world saw little. Illness was masked by silence. Recovery was paraded as strength. And death, when it came, was transformed into ceremony. Even in sickness, the family performed. The medical treatments themselves were often worse than the illnesses. A cough might earn you a spoonful of syrup spiked with opiates. A stomach ache might be treated with mercury. A fever might bring bloodletting or blistering. Doctors, armed with confidence and dubious science, prescribed remedies that would horrify us today. But in the palace, as in the rest of Victorian Britain, these were seen as modern miracles. Even the air could betray you. Palaces were drafty and damp, their coal fires filling rooms with soot and smoke. The very effort to keep warm in winter filled lungs with toxins. Servants coughed, children wheezed, and still the fires roared on. Coal was progress, coal was empire, and coal was slow suffocation disguised as warmth. And yet, somehow, the family endured. Children grew up under this cloud of hidden dangers, their health constantly balanced against the need for appearances. If you were pale and tired, you were told to be brave. If you fainted at dinner, you were carried out discreetly, as if nothing had happened. If you coughed blood into a handkerchief, it was folded away quickly before the guests could notice. The body was always secondary to the performance. Think of the irony. Palaces, symbols of power and permanence, were riddled with threats more insidious than any assassin's blade. The wallpaper, the curtains, the toys, the very fashion, all lethal in their own quiet ways. And still, the family smiled for portraits, posed for ceremonies, and carried on as though nothing were wrong. Imagine yourself there, sitting in a nursery with lead-painted toys, breathing air laced with soot, your governess ready with a spoonful of laudanum if you make too much noise. You don't know the words for poison or narcotics. You only know that your head feels heavy, your chest feels tight, and laughter always seems to end with a cough. Yet the day continues. Lessons, etiquette, appearances. Illness is inconvenient. The show must go on. Victoria herself was no stranger to this paradox. She suffered illnesses, aches, and exhaustion, yet she soldiered on. Her children, too, endured childhood diseases, injuries, and ailments, all swept into the rhythm of palace life. Servants whispered about sickness, but to the public, the family appeared steadfast, eternal, untouched. The truth, the headaches, the fainting spells, the hidden deaths of infants, was quietly absorbed into the fabric of duty. And so, the royal household embodied the Victorian paradox: progress on the surface, danger underneath. Science, medicine, fashion, and architecture promised improvement, yet carried hidden costs. The palaces were beautiful, yes, but they were also lethal laboratories, where every breath, every sip of medicine, every squeeze of a corset chipped away at health in the name of propriety. Step back just for a moment and look again at that palace. The marble gleams, the silver shines, the portraits watch with solemn eyes. It looks indestructible, eternal. But listen closer. You can hear the cough of a servant in the corridor. You can picture a child's hand gripping a lead-painted toy. You can smell the sharp bite of coal smoke in the air. Beneath the grandeur lies fragility, hidden but constant. That was life in the Victorian royal household. Not just grandeur, but risk. Not just stability, but sickness lurking behind every lace curtain. And through it all, appearances had to be maintained. You smiled, you posed, you performed. Because in this family, health was not about survival. It was about keeping up the illusion that nothing, not arsenic, not laudanum, not even death itself, could ever touch the crown. After all the ceremonies, the etiquette drills, the endless processions and stiff-backed meals, you may be wondering, what happened when the palace doors finally closed? Did the Victorian royals ever get to let their hair down, metaphorically at least, since no portrait of Victoria suggests she ever once considered loosening hers? Did they have anything resembling a private life? The answer is yes, but it was private in the most Victorian way possible, carefully measured, heavily supervised, and never entirely free from duty. Let's start with Albert's games at Christmas. Despite his reputation as a stern moralist, Albert occasionally softened. Around the Christmas tree, he sometimes played simple games with his children. Charades, riddles, even small contests of wit. Imagine a man who spent most of the year scowling over lesson plans, suddenly putting on a paper crown and trying, somewhat awkwardly, to mime a donkey. For a moment the household laughed. The children saw not just a reformer, but a father. It was warmth, fleeting but real. Victoria, too, had moments of tenderness, though they often appeared not in person but in her journals. She wrote endlessly about her children, their first words, their illnesses, their triumphs at lessons. She recorded her pride in Albert, her sorrow when the children misbehaved, her delight in small domestic details. Reading her private musings, you glimpse a woman who loved deeply, who longed for closeness, even if she rarely showed it in daily life. And the children remembered rare bursts of informal affection. A walk in the gardens when Victoria was in a good mood. A family musical evening when Albert played the organ and everyone sang together. Occasional laughter at the dinner table when something genuinely funny pierced the armor of decorum. These were the cracks in the marble, the brief reminders that beneath all the ceremony, the royals were human beings who sometimes smiled without checking whether the smile was proper. But don't let these glimpses fool you. For every moment of warmth, there was a shadow. Even in laughter, duty hovered nearby. Albert's Christmas games were not chaotic affairs of flying toys and shrieking children. They were still orderly, still moral lessons in disguise. Even Victoria's journal entries, heartfelt though they were, often circled back to disappointment, criticism, or reminders that the children must embody virtue. Private life existed, but it was never unshackled. And then there was the constant presence of servants. Imagine trying to have a private conversation when a footman stands 2 steps away, waiting to refill your glass, or attempting to confide in your mother when a governess lingers just behind the door. Privacy was a luxury the royal family never really had. Every word risked being overheard, every gesture observed, every sulk reported. Children learned early that even their most intimate moments were staged against an audience they couldn't dismiss. Nor could the family escape the press. Newspapers and magazines of the Victorian era adored covering the royals, publishing illustrations of their domestic bliss. A drawing of Victoria and Albert gathered around the Christmas tree became one of the most famous images of the age, reproduced in middle-class parlors across Britain. But what looked like cozy family life to the public was, for the royals, another performance. When the artist was invited in, they were expected to smile, to pose, to appear as the perfect model of family virtue. The sketch might have been genuine in its outlines, but it was also propaganda. Even politics seeped into the supposed sanctuary of private life. If Victoria wished to spend time with her children, there was always a minister demanding her attention. If Albert wanted to enjoy an afternoon walk, there were always documents piled on his desk. The palace was a home in name, but a workplace in reality. For the royal family, private life meant duty with the curtains drawn. Imagine yourself as one of those children again. You sneak a laugh with your siblings in the nursery, only to have the governess clear her throat, ominously. You see your father join a game of charades, only for him to turn the laughter into a lecture about morality before long. You catch your mother smiling at you fondly, only for her to retreat into her journal, recording your behavior for posterity. Private life feels like sunlight breaking briefly through storm clouds. Lovely, yes, but gone almost as soon as it appears. The paradox is striking. The Victorian royal family presented themselves to the world as the epitome of domestic virtue, a model for Britain's rising middle classes, and in a way, they did live it. They gathered for Christmas trees, sang songs together, enjoyed moments of intimacy. But those same moments were encased in ritual, shadowed by politics, haunted by the awareness that they were always being watched. Step back and look at the pattern. Public ceremony bled into private life. Private affection bled into public image. There was no neat divide. Even their supposed privacy was political currency. The children's laughter could be turned into an engraving. The Queen's grief could become national policy. Albert's family games could be reported as proof of moral strength. Every flicker of humanity doubled as a symbol. So yes, there was a private royal family. They laughed, they loved, they teased each other. They even played games at Christmas. But never without someone watching. Never without someone recording. Never without the weight of expectation pressing down on every smile. Picture it one last time. The family gathered in a parlor, candles flickering on the tree, Albert telling a riddle, Victoria scribbling in her journal, children trying to suppress giggles under the governess's watchful eye. For a fleeting second, it feels almost ordinary. But then you notice the footman waiting in the corner, the artist sketching discreetly by the wall, the awareness that tomorrow, this private moment will be reported in papers across the empire. And that's the truth of the Victorian royals' private life. It wasn't really private at all. It was simply a softer performance, played behind closed doors, where even love had to wear the costume of duty. By now, you've walked through the marble corridors, survived the nursery, endured the mealtimes, and even suffered through Christmas under Albert's orderly eye. And you might be asking, what exactly was all this for? Why the endless drills, the suffocating etiquette, the rationed joy? What was success in the Victorian royal family supposed to look like? The answer, naturally, is not what you'd expect. Success here was not measured in laughter, affection, or even health. It was measured in appearances, silence at the table, respectable posture in portraits, the ability to recite French verbs without flinching, the knack for smiling politely while your insides ached from corsets or boredom. To survive this household and emerge as a success meant you had learned the single most important lesson. The image mattered more than the reality. Take Victoria herself. She was not, by modern measures, a warm or accessible mother. She often struggled with her children, scolded them harshly, and held them at a distance. And yet, she triumphed because she projected herself as the perfect widow, the model of respectable mourning. Her black dresses became her legacy, her sorrow a symbol of constancy. Success was not about how happy she felt, but about how convincing she appeared. Albert's measure of success was even clearer. He wanted his children to be paragons of morality, diligent, disciplined, intellectually sharp, and above all, obedient. A child who laughed too loudly, who resisted lessons, who showed too much individuality, that was failure. A child who sat straight, spoke carefully, and endured the endless grind without complaint, that was victory. So imagine yourself growing up in this palace. You might never once feel that your parents understood you. You might long for affection that comes without lectures. But if you could hold yourself upright at a drawing room tea, if you could speak in perfect German to a visiting dignitary, if you could carry your mother's grief with stoic silence, then you were considered a success, not loved more, not cherished more, simply considered acceptable. This definition of success carried forward into the children's adult lives. Their marriages were not judged by happiness, but by strategy. Each wedding was a chess move, carefully plotted to extend Victoria's influence. And in this, the royal family succeeded spectacularly. Victoria earned the title Grandmother of Europe for a reason. Her children and grandchildren sat on thrones across the continent: Germany, Russia, Spain, Denmark, Greece. The family tree sprouted branches that reached into nearly every royal court of the 19th century. To the Victorians, this was the ultimate proof of success. Not that the children thrived as individuals, but that they expanded the dynasty's shadow until it stretched across Europe like a great intricate net. The irony, of course, is that the net eventually tangled. Those same grandchildren who were supposed to secure peace across Europe ended up facing each other on the battlefields of World War I. Cousins exchanged telegrams pleading for peace, then ordered armies against one another. Family portraits turned into propaganda posters. Success, as the Victorians defined it, had been achieved. Alliances woven tight through marriage. But the cost was high, and the result, ultimately, catastrophic. Still, within the palace, the standard never changed. Happiness was never the metric. Respectability was. If your household looked orderly, if your clothing spoke of virtue, if your children behaved with drilled obedience, then you were a model royal. What went on behind closed doors, the exhaustion, the sorrow, the loneliness, didn't matter. It was the performance that counted. And yet, success wasn't entirely hollow. There was a kind of triumph in survival itself. For all their suffocating rules, the Victorians managed to hold together a monarchy during a century of revolutions. While thrones toppled across Europe, Victoria's crown remained steady. Her family, bound by appearances, managed to convince their subjects that monarchy still had value. If it required silence at the table and endless rituals of grief, so be it. Picture the end of a royal year. The calendar crammed with ceremonies completed, the portraits painted, the alliances sealed. Everyone is exhausted, but everyone is still standing, still performing. The nation looks on and sees strength, continuity, permanence. Behind the curtains, you may feel drained, but to the outside world, you look invincible. That, in the Victorian sense, is success. And as you linger in those corridors, think about what legacy means here. It isn't about passing on warmth or laughter. It isn't about children remembering bedtime stories or carefree holidays. It's about dynasties, alliances, and images that endure long after the laughter dies. Victoria's journals survived. Albert's lesson plans shaped generations. Their children, scattered across Europe, carried the brand of duty into every palace they entered. The personal cost, the loneliness, the repression, the lack of intimacy was immense. But from the outside, the spectacle gleamed. The monarchy endured. The queen became an icon. The children became pawns, yes, but also dynastic pillars. History remembers them not for their joy, but for their utility. So when you hear success and legacy in the Victorian royal family, remember, it did not mean love. It did not mean happiness. It meant survival of the image. And in that, they excelled. Imagine yourself standing for a portrait, the painter fussing with your pose. Your siblings line up beside you. Your mother insists you stand straighter. Your father corrects your expression. The portrait takes hours. Your smile aches. Your legs tremble. But when the painting is unveiled, no one sees your exhaustion. They see a perfect family, respectable and strong. That painting is your success. That painting is your legacy. And that is the paradox of Victorian royal life. The more personal cost you bore, the greater the appearance of triumph. The less private joy you had, the more public respect you gained. Legacy was not what you felt. It was what you projected, and what others believed long after you were gone. You've made it. You've survived the day inside the Victorian royal household. You rose at dawn to scratch out journal entries. You endured Albert's moral lectures, and you sat through meals where silence was the only seasoning. You stood stiff in drawing rooms, bowed your head in ceremonies, and kept your smile painted on even when the arsenic wallpaper made you queasy. You played the role of dutiful royal child, dutiful parent, dutiful symbol. And somehow you lasted. Now the day is done. The palace begins to quiet. The footsteps of servants fade into the distance, their shoes clicking one last time on the marble. The coal fire burns low, leaving behind the soft hiss of embers. The gaslight flickers, then dims, shadows stretching long across the walls lined with portraits of ancestors who scowled even in oil paint. The corridors, endless and echoing by day, now soften into silence. It is tempting to believe the royals lived wrapped in luxury, palaces, jewels, gilded furniture, but you've seen it differently now. Their luxury was a cage, a gilded prison lined with lace curtains and upholstered duty, every laugh rationed, every gesture measured, every gift moralized. Even joy had to perform. And here you are, lying down, free of their weight. No governess will scold you for crooked posture. No queen will record your faults in her diary. No prince will lecture you about morality before breakfast. You can breathe deeply, laugh if you want, or drift into sleep without consequence. Unlike them, you are free to slouch, to sprawl, to let your shoulders drop as the day releases its grip. So rest. Let the gaslight fade completely. Let the corridors vanish. Let the palace dissolve into darkness. Because tonight, history is behind you, and the only thing left to do is sleep. And as you drift off tonight, remember, you can take these stories with you ad-free anytime. My first collection, Victorian Madness Volume 1, is available now, complete with a bonus insider story you won't hear on YouTube. Only a handful of copies are released at this time, and the link is waiting in both the description and pinned comment. Sleep well.